Welcome to Module 4, Describe General Security and Network Security Features. It shouldn't be a surprise to you that security is a big deal for Microsoft and for its customers. In this module, we'll cover some of the features in Azure that can help you address security with your resources. In Lesson 8, we'll talk about the security features in Azure, including Azure Security Center, Key Vault, Azure Sentinel, and Azure Dedicated Host. Then in Lesson 9, you'll learn about network security in Azure. We'll talk about general network security, and we'll look at Azure networking security services like Azure Firewall, network security groups, and Azure DDoS protection. Lesson 8, Describe Azure Security Features. In this lesson, we'll talk about services in Azure that can help you secure your resources. We'll start off with Azure Security Center and how it can give you security insights and recommendations on best practices, and how it can also help you to fix problems quickly. We'll then talk about how you can secure secrets with Azure Key Vault and how you can secure your data with Azure Sentinel. And that includes on-premises data, data that's in Azure, and even data that's in other clouds. We'll wrap up this lesson with Azure Dedicated Host and how it can help you comply with security requirements that might be in place in your company. Azure Security Center is a single portal for monitoring and managing the security of your Azure resources, but not just Azure resources. The Security Center agent allows for you to do the same for your on-premises resources. There are two tiers of service in Azure Security Center. The free tier offers the service for VMs and app service only. Standard offers the service for virtual machines, app service, but also SQL databases, MySQL, PostgreSQL, blob storage, and many more. Let's head over to the Azure portal and have a look at Azure Security Center. So we're back in the Azure portal here. This should look familiar to you by now. And Security Center is one of our Azure services. By the way, if you don't have it listed here in your list of services, you can click More Services and search for it. And if I open the Security Center, I get an overview here of the policy and compliance for my particular subscription. And at the top here, I can also see my secure score, which is right now at 365 out of 565. If I want to dig into more details about my secure score, I can click the link to review my secure score, and as I take actions recommended by Security Center, my overall secure score will improve. And this gives me a great tool for monitoring the overall security of all my Azure resources. And I can also scroll down and look at the resource security hygiene for the different resources that I have. If I'm interested in drilling into this, I can hover over one of these and click on it, and that'll take me to that resource, and it'll show me an overview, and it'll also give me some details on things that I need to do to improve my security score for that. Another really important feature of Azure Security Center is regulatory compliance. So if I click on regulatory compliance here on the left, I can see my compliance with different regulatory standards. And if I scroll down, I can see details of each one of those standards as it relates to different areas of compliance. And so I can go in here and expand this, and I can drill in as far as I need to see where I need to take some action on my compliance. And just as you can with a lot of other similar features in Azure, you can download a report of this if you'd like to provide this information to other people who might be better suited to resolve some of these things. Now, if I want an all-in-one view of the security recommendations, I can click Recommendations right here. And that provides a similar view that we were looking at earlier. And here I can also download a comma-separated values report that shows what all of these recommendations are, and then I can provide those to the correct person to take care of those. And notice as I scroll down, I get a nice indicator here that shows me not only what the recommendations are and how many failed resources I have for that recommendation, but I also have the severity level, and I also can see here how much my security score will increase if I address each one of these things. And notice some of these things can be fixed with a quick fix. So for example, if I click here, which says quick fix, this is something that Azure Security Center can actually resolve for me automatically. If I go to remediation steps, I can just click right here to remediate this with a single click. It's pretty common for an application to use sensitive information. For example, you might connect to a database and your application might need access to a username and a password for that database. Now, one option for that kind of thing is to just store the connection string for that database in a configuration file, but doing that could be insecure. Azure Key Vault is a solution for storing secrets, keys, and certificates that an Azure resource might need to use. Once you store something in Key Vault, you can then apply security policies that define which users and applications can access it. Key Vault is encrypted using encryption keys, but Microsoft has no visibility of those encryption keys or the data that you store in Key Vault. Now, there are two pricing tiers for Key Vault, standard tier and premium tier. In premium tier, access keys are stored in hardware security modules, or HSMs. And an HSM is a separate piece of hardware that's specifically designed for securely storing encrypted content. Because the Federal Information Processing Standard, or FIPS 140-2, requires an HSM boundary for encrypted data, the premium tier is required for all FIPS 140-2 compliance. Figuring out how to keep your data and resources secure is a really complex task. That's why many companies turn to some tried and proven frameworks to help them focus on what's important. Two of those frameworks are Security Orchestration, Automation, and Response, or SOAR, and Security Information and Event Management, or SIEM. In fact, many companies will use both SOAR and SIEM for their security needs. Implementing these frameworks can be difficult, and a lot of companies will spend a lot of money to hire someone to implement these frameworks for them. Microsoft really wanted to make SOAR and SIEM easier to implement, even for people who aren't security experts. And the result of that work is Azure Sentinel. Azure Sentinel is a service designed to provide threat reporting and analysis for your data and resources. And it's not just for Azure. It can also work with on-premises resources or even resources on other cloud providers. Azure Sentinel sits on top of Azure Log Analytics. As Log Analytics collects information about your resources, Azure Sentinel watches the data for threats and reports on them. To connect Azure Sentinel to your resources, you use connectors. And there are connectors for Azure services, and there are also connectors that enable you to use Sentinel with on-premises resources and with other cloud providers, as I mentioned a minute ago. If Sentinel discovers a threat, it responds to that threat using a playbook. And a playbook is a workflow that performs a series of tasks when a threat is found. Sentinel uses logic apps for playbook functionality. And there's an Azure Sentinel trigger in logic apps that enables the connection between logic apps and Azure Sentinel. When you create a VM in Azure, your VM is running on a physical computer that is not dedicated to you. While your VM itself is isolated, you're still running that VM on a computer that other Azure customers are also using. For many people, that's perfectly fine, but in some situations, that kind of scenario might not meet the requirements. If you need a computer, a physical server, that's dedicated to your Azure subscription, Azure Dedicated Hosts is for you. Azure Dedicated Hosts allow you to achieve dedicated hardware isolation. No one else is using the physical computer that your VMs run on. These dedicated hosts are in the same data centers and have the same networks and other underlying infrastructure, but they're dedicated to your VMs. With Azure Dedicated Hosts, you have control over impact caused by maintenance events in Azure because you can opt in to the exact maintenance window that works best for you. The way this works is you can choose to skip the automatic update to your host and choose your own date and time to apply the update. Now, you'll eventually have to apply the update, but you can choose to do so within a 35-day rolling window, so you have more control over when it gets applied. You can also benefit by using Azure Hybrid Benefit, and this is where you use your own licenses for Windows Server and SQL Server, and you can benefit from using the Standard Edition and also a Data Center Edition license for both VMs and the host computer itself. Azure Dedicated Hosts are created in host groups, and host groups allow you to take advantage of availability zones. You then add your dedicated host to your host group, and then you can run VMs on those hosts. Using Azure Dedicated Hosts can provide both high availability and fault tolerance through the use of availability zones and fault domains. And this will give you the peace of mind when hosting your Azure resources on a dedicated host. Let's continue our discussion of security. In Lesson 9, Describe Azure Network Security, we'll focus on the networking side of security. We'll start off with an explanation of defense in depth and how network security should be structured. We'll then cover how you can secure traffic flowing within your network with network security groups, how you can secure traffic flowing into and out of your network with Azure Firewall, and how you can prevent malicious attacks with Azure DDoS protection. Just for a minute, imagine that you live in this castle in medieval times. Everyone who doesn't live in this castle is fighting to try to get into this castle. So to stop them, the owners of the castle built a tall wall around the castle. And that stopped a lot of people trying to get in, but the persistent intruders just dug tunnels under that wall. So to take care of that, the castle owners put a moat filled with water around the outside of the wall. And by the way, they did not put crocodiles in these moats. I looked it up. Now, even with all that security in place, they also placed archers on the high walls, and they built a sturdy gate at the entrance, and they stationed guards with swords just inside that entrance. This is a great example of what's called defense in depth. And it's why defense in depth is sometimes called the castle approach. This multi-layered approach is the best way to keep your network safe. Azure Firewall can help prevent a bad guy from making it into your network. Network security groups can help control the traffic inside your network. And Azure DDoS protection can help to identify malicious traffic and prevent it from impacting your network. You might remember this image from earlier. It represents a 3-tier application using an Azure virtual network that's divided into 3 subnets. Now, in order to make this kind of configuration secure, you need to control how network traffic can flow. For example, you don't want the middle tier or the data tier to be exposed to the internet, and you don't want the web tier to be able to communicate with the data tier. To control the traffic into and out of an Azure virtual network and between the resources in that network, You can use network security groups, or NSGs. NSGs use inbound and outbound rules to control the flow of network traffic. These rules can use a specific IP address or an IP address range, such as the range of a subnet, and you associate rules with either a subnet or a network interface. You can specify a priority between 100 and 4096 for each rule that's in an NSG, and rules with lower numbers are actually processed first. Once network traffic matches one of your NSG rules, none of the other rules get processed. So that means that a lower priority value is actually a higher priority than a higher priority value. After the rule is matched, the NSG creates a flow record for the connection, and traffic that corresponds to that flow record will be allowed even without an explicit rule. So, for example, if an NSG rule allows incoming traffic to an IP range on port 80, the resulting flow record will also allow outbound traffic on port 80 over that same IP range, even without an explicit outbound rule. But once that traffic stops flowing for a few minutes, that flow record will no longer be effective. Now, there's some cases where you won't know the IP address range of network traffic. Traffic from the internet might be one example of that. But you may also want to apply an NSG to network traffic coming from another Azure service, and you won't always know the IP address range in that scenario either. To solve that problem, NSGs allow you to use service tags to apply rules, and a service tag is a special identifier created by Microsoft that applies to the internet and to Azure services. You know, the internet can be a dangerous place. Check out this scenario. I've got an Azure VM inside of my Azure Virtual Network, and people from my on-premises office need to connect to this VM. Since people that aren't in my on-premises office can also access this over the network because it's connected to the internet, a bad actor might cause some pretty awful problems for me. Now, to solve this kind of problem, you can use a firewall outside of your virtual network. With a firewall installed and configured to allow traffic only from my on-premises network, that same bad actor is going to be denied access into my network. But people on my on-premises network will be allowed to get to my VM. There are firewalls available from third parties that you can use in Azure, but Microsoft also provides its own firewall that's called, as you might have guessed, Azure Firewall. Azure Firewall is a PaaS offering, and like NSGs, it uses rules to determine if traffic should be allowed. There are three types of rules in Azure Firewall. Network Address Translation, or NAT rules, are rules that forward traffic from the firewall to another device on the network. NAT rules are always applied first. Network rules allow traffic on specific IP address ranges and ports, and that's the type of rule I'd likely use to allow people on my on-premises network to access my VM. Application rules allow applications to communicate across my network. So, for example, I could use an application rule to allow Windows Update to communicate across my network. Application rules can also be used to allow domain names. Rules are applied using a priority between 100 and 65,000. And just like priorities on NSG rules, rules that have a lower number are applied first. If network traffic doesn't match any rules, it gets blocked. Azure Firewall is also a stateful firewall, and that means it remembers the state of connections that it allows. For example, if traffic is allowed from my on-premises network, and then a bad guy hacks that connection from another device and attempts to access my resources, Azure Firewall would block that connection because it would notice that the hardware MAC address of the network card using that connection changed. It stores the state of the connection, and if something in that state changes, it will block that traffic. Even traffic that your firewall allows can represent a threat against your application. For example, a distributed denial of service attack, or a DDoS attack, can use what seems like normal traffic to overwhelm an application's resources and make it unavailable. DDoS attacks can also be used to exploit some vulnerabilities that exist within your application. Azure provides a service called DDoS protection that can help protect you from DDoS attacks. And there are two tiers of DDoS protection, basic and standard. The basic tier protects you from volume-based DDoS attacks by distributing large amounts of volume across a wide array of Azure's infrastructure. This all happens automatically as part of Azure, and you don't have any control over it. You also don't have any reporting capability or visibility into what's happening. As I said, it's all automatic. Standard, on the other hand, is a paid offering, and while basic applies to both IPv4 and IPv6 traffic, standard applies only to IPv6 traffic. The standard tier uses machine learning to profile network traffic and determine the level of the threat. And you can use a single standard plan to protect multiple virtual networks. And that's important because while basic DDoS protection is free, a standard plan will cost you $2,944 per month. As you might imagine, the standard plan is really targeted at enterprise customers who need that level of protection for their apps. Welcome to Module 5, Describe Identity, Governance, Privacy, and Compliance Features. In Lesson 10, we'll talk about authentication and authorization, and we'll talk about Azure Identity services like Azure Active Directory, conditional access, multi-factor authentication, and single sign-on. In Lesson 11, we'll cover governance. You'll learn about role-based access control, Azure policy, resource locks, tags, and Azure Blueprints. You'll also find out about the Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure. Then in Lesson 12, we'll discuss privacy and compliance. You'll find out about the Microsoft Privacy Statement, the Online Service Terms and Data Protection Amendment, Trust Center, Azure Compliance, and Azure Sovereign Regions that address specific compliance needs for governments and specific regions. Lesson 10, Describe Core Azure Identity Services. We'll begin this lesson with a discussion of authentication and authorization and how they differ from each other. We'll then talk about Azure Active Directory and how you can use it to control access to Azure resources and to third-party sites as well. You'll learn about how you can use conditional access to enforce policies on the kinds of devices that users use when accessing your resources, and how multi-factor authentication can ensure a more secure experience. We'll also cover single sign-on and how it can make your life easier when it comes to logging into your resources. Here's my shiny new Surface 3 notebook computer. Now when I first sit down at my computer, I have to log in before I can do anything. And I can log in using a few different methods. I might use a password, I might use a biometric device like a fingerprint reader or my camera, and I might also use a certificate. In fact, I might have to use more than one of these methods in combination to log in. Now once I log in, the computer knows who I am. It knows I'm Jim. And this process of determining who you are is called authentication. So now that I've logged in, I decide to create a new document in Microsoft Word. Now at this point, the operating system on the computer has to figure out if I'm even allowed to create a new Word doc on this computer. That process of deciding what I'm allowed to do is called authorization. Now you might have already known what authentication and authorization are, but if you didn't, you'd have a hard time with some of the information we're about to cover. So now that we all know about authentication and authorization, we're all on the same page, Let's talk about Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory is a cloud-based identity service in Azure, and you can think of identity as a combination of authentication and authorization. Azure Active Directory contains a directory of entities called security principles, and a security principle can be a user principle that refers to a user. It can be a service principle that represents an application in Azure Active Directory, and we'll look at those here in just a minute. And it can also be a managed identity, which is a special kind of service principle for use with Azure resources. Service principles, or entities, can be assigned roles in Azure Active Directory, and those roles determine what that entity can do. That's the authorization component of Azure Active Directory. You can use Azure Active Directory to use identity services with third-party services using Azure Active Directory applications. And there are applications available from Microsoft and from many third parties. For example, you can give someone in your company access to your company's Twitter account by using the Twitter application in Azure Active Directory. Giving access to other accounts using Azure Active Directory is a great solution because when you want to remove that access, you just remove the user's access in Azure Active Directory. If you were instead to give that same user direct access to your Twitter account by giving them your Twitter username and password, you'd have to change your Twitter username and password to remove that access. So let's have a look at Azure Active Directory in the Azure portal. So I'm here in the Azure portal, and I'm just going to click right here on Azure Active Directory to open my Active Directory. And if I click here on users, I can see all of the users that are members of my Azure Active Directory. And if I click on one of these users, I can see when that user is signed in. I can see information on that user's identity. And if I scroll down, I have other information as well. In this case, I don't have information filled in for contact info, but if I did, I'd have all of that information here as well. Now, this user, as it so happens, is my user account as an admin of this subscription, and it's a Microsoft account. But you can also have guest users in Azure Active Directory. So if I go back here to the All Users screen, I can create a new user here, which actually would be either an Azure Active Directory user or a Microsoft account. But if I have someone who maybe exists in a different company and I want them to have some level of access to my Azure resources, I can use the guest user option, and then I can either create a user and give their user ID, or I can invite a user from a different organization as a guest user, and then they can actually collaborate with me with my Azure resources. Now, one important concept of this is the concept of roles. And if I go into roles and administrators, I can see the roles that are available within my Azure Active Directory. So I see that I have application administrator, I see a description of that role, and so when I create users, I can assign them to a specific role, and that controls what level of access they have to my Azure Active Directory. So for example, if I go back into users and I look at my user account, and then I click on Assigned Roles, I can see which roles have been applied to this particular user. You've seen that you can use Azure Active Directory to give users access to apps and resources, but you might want to take security a step further. Suppose, for example, you've given a user access to your Microsoft 365 account through Azure Active Directory, but you want to make sure that user can't access your account using a mobile device. Or let's say you want to allow that user to access the account only from certain networks. Azure Conditional Access will give you that level of control. Conditional Access uses policies that you can apply to users, and those policies are applied using assignments and access controls. Assignments define who a policy applies to, and also the conditions that must be met, such as a certain platform like iOS, Android, or Windows. Assignments can also be used to require a certain IP address range or something like that. Access controls determine how a policy is enforced. The most restrictive access control is block access, but you can also use access controls to do things such as require that a user's device meets certain conditions or that they're using an approved application to access your resources. Conditional access is available only in the Azure Active Directory Premium tier. By the way, you can also use conditional access to require that a user authenticates using multi-factor authentication. Now remember when we talked about authentication that I pointed out that you can authenticate using different methods, and these methods are referred to as authentication factors. And multi-factor authentication requires that you use more than one factor. One authentication factor is something you know, such as a username or a password. Another factor is something you have, such as a phone or a tablet, or it might also be a device that can display a time-sensitive access code you have to enter. The third factor is something that you are, and this refers to your fingerprint or some other biometric component, such as your facial structure, or even the pattern of blood vessels in your retina. Azure Active Directory offers multi-factor authentication, and Azure multi-factor authentication is two-factor authentication. That means it requires that you use the first two authentication factors in order to log in. Azure multi-factor authentication is only available in the Azure Active Directory Premium plans, and you enable it in the All Users blade of your Azure Active Directory in the Azure portal. You enable multi-factor authentication on a per-user basis, and you can also configure it for guest users in Azure Active Directory by using conditional access. Another great identity feature in Azure is called single sign-on. Suppose you need to use data from multiple servers to prepare a report for your manager. Each time you access a different server, you have to enter your username and your password all over again, and that can get pretty frustrating. With single sign-on, you log in with your credentials once, and your credentials are then sent to an identity provider, and that identity provider uses your credentials to issue you a token, and a token is just an encrypted entity that you can use to authenticate. When you access other servers, instead of having to enter your username and password again, the server simply uses the token that you've already received to log you in. Tokens have information embedded in them that makes all this possible, and those pieces of information are referred to as claims. There's a claim that defines who you are, a claim that tells the server when the token was issued and when it expires, and there's also a claim that lets the server know the token is valid for that specific server. Lesson 11, Describe Azure Governance Features. In this lesson, you'll learn about role-based access control and how you can use it to give others a specific level of access to your resources. You'll find out how you can use locks and how they can prevent others from changing or deleting resources. We'll talk about tags for resources, and you'll find out about Azure policy to control the way that others who have access to your Azure resources can interact with them. We'll talk about how you can create easily reproducible environments using Azure Blueprints. And we'll wrap up the lesson with a discussion of the Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure. So you've learned about some cool features for authenticating and authorizing users, but let's take the concept of authorization a little deeper. Suppose you want to allow users in a certain department of your company to access some of the virtual machines in your Azure account, and some of those users should also be able to not only remote into the VMs, but also change some settings on the VMs. Others should be allowed access, but not be allowed to change any settings. Now that sounds like a pretty complicated thing to do based on what you've learned so far, but it's actually easy using a feature called role-based access control. Role-based access control, or RBAC, authorizes users to perform certain things using a role that you assign the user to. In Azure, role-based access control is based on 4 elements. The first element is a security principal, which is an element that represents an identity. A security principal can be a user, but it can also be a group or an application. And when a security principal represents an application, it's actually called a service principal. A security principal can also be a special entity called a managed identity. And managed identities allow you to authorize an Azure service. The next element is a role. And the role, or a role definition, defines how the security principal can interact with an Azure resource. For example, the role might define that the security principal can read the properties of a resource, but it can't change any of those properties. The third element is scope, and this defines the level at which the role is applied. So for example, if the scope is a resource group, the role applies to all resources in the resource group. And the fourth and final element is role assignments. Roles are assigned to a security principal at a particular scope, and that's what ultimately defines the level of access for the security principal. Now, RBAC includes many common built-in roles, and 3 of these apply to all Azure resources. They're the owner role, which gives the security principal full access to resources, the contributor role, which allows for resources to be created and managed, but the role can't be delegated to another security principal. And then the reader role gives access to see Azure resources, but it does not allow for resources to be created, deleted, or managed. So to make this clearer, let's have a look at RBAC in the Azure portal. This is my virtual machine in the Azure portal. And if I wanted to give someone the ability to access this virtual machine, I can click right here on Access Control. This is where you configure RBAC in the Azure portal. So the first thing I want to do is click on Add, and that allows me to add a role assignment for a user. I'm going to select one of the built-in roles, and we talked about the top 3 earlier, the owner, contributor, and reader. I'm actually going to give someone contributor access to this particular VM. So I'll select contributor. Now I need to determine, am I going to assign this access to a user, a group, or a service principal? And notice if I drop this down, I can see also some managed identities. We've talked a little bit about managed identities before, and notice that those managed identities are all Azure services. So I could give, for example, app service access to this VM by just selecting this. In this case, I'm going to use a user, and I'm going to have a user who is actually a member of my Azure Active Directory, and that's this person right here, Christine Conrad. So I've selected her. She now appears down here under Selected Members, and now I'm going to save. So once I've added her, if I go into Role Assignments, I can see that a contributor on this VM is Christine Conrad. I can see her role right here. And notice the scope is this resource. Notice also that Jim Test right here is a reader on this VM, but the scope of that is at the subscription level. So that means that this user, Jim Test, has reader role assignment to everything within this subscription. If I wanted to remove Jim from that, I would need to go to the subscription and remove him. Locks prevent changes or deleting of Azure resources, and unlike RBAC, locks apply to all users no matter what level of access they have to that resource. So let's look at a quick example of using locks. So here's one of my VMs in the Azure portal. Let's go ahead and add a lock to this so it can't be deleted. So I'm going to go down in the menu here, and I'm underneath the settings area, I'm going to choose locks. There are no locks currently assigned to this, so I'm going to go ahead and click add. I'm going to give this lock a name, which is no delete, because I want to create a lock that keeps people from deleting this. And then I choose the lock type. Now notice there are a couple of different lock types. There's read only, which means that you can look at this resource, but you can't change anything. You can't change the configuration, and by the way, you also can't delete it. Or there's a delete lock, which means you can change the configuration of this all you want to, but if you try to delete it, it's not going to allow you to do that. So let's make this a delete lock. I can add some notes if I want to. Don't really need to do that, so I'm going to say OK. And now there is a lock on this VM. So let's go back to the home screen, and I'm going to go back into that VM. And what I want to do now is I want to delete this virtual machine. So I'll click on delete right here, and it warns me this is actually going to delete it. I'll say yes, and notice it didn't work. And the reason for that is because there's a lock on this VM, and that prevents me from deleting it. So if I wanted to remove that lock so I can delete it, I can go down here to locks again, and I'll scroll over here a little bit. This is the no delete lock that I created. So if I click on delete right here, I can delete that lock, and now I would be able to delete that VM. One of the features in Azure that makes it easier to manage and organize resources is tags. A tag is a name-value pair that is applied to Azure resources. The name and value can both be anything you decide. For example, if you have a lot of Azure VMs for the sales department in your company, and you have other VMs for the IT department, you could tag each with a name of department and a value of either sales or IT. And you can then view all resources associated with a specific tag in the Azure portal. Another big advantage to tags is that they help you with billing. Your Azure invoice will display the tags you've added to your resources. So in the example I just used, you'd be able to easily see how much your sales department VMs cost and how much your IT department VMs cost. In addition to security concerns, you're likely going to encounter governance concerns with cloud applications. For example, your company might have a policy that specifies that no virtual machine should be created within a particular region because that region doesn't offer some required features that you have. Azure Policy is a tool that can help you to enforce policies like this. Azure Policy uses policies to define rules that apply to Azure resource creation and management. So let's have a look at Azure Policy in the Azure portal. So here's Azure Policy in the portal. Now the first thing you might want to do is check out the Getting Started page right here. This is where you can access information on viewing definitions and assigning policies and checking out compliance of your policies and even creating your own custom policies. You can also see some recommended policy assignments here that you can apply just by clicking on them. Now, if I want to see all of the policy definitions that are in effect for me, I can click on Definitions right here. And I see that there are many different built-in policies that are currently in effect for me. If I want to create my own policy, I can click right here on Policy Definition. And now I can define my own policy. And one of the interesting aspects of policies is this property right here called effect. In this sample rule, you can see that the effect is audit, and that means that if this policy is not complied with, a warning will be logged so that I'll be aware of it. However, there are actually 5 other effects that you can specify in a policy. The append effect adds additional properties to a resource. And this can be used to do things like automatically add a tag with a specific value to resources when they get created. The audit if not exists effect allows me to specify a resource type that must exist along with the resource that's being created. And if that resource type does not exist, a warning gets logged. The deny effect denies the create or update operation. And the deploy if not exists is similar to the audit if not exists effect, but instead of just logging a warning, it will automatically deploy the required resource type. And finally, the disabled effect means that the policy is not in effect. So once I've created a policy, I can assign that policy by going right here to Assignments, and then I can click here on Assign Policy and assign that policy to my subscription or to another scope. Now, if I click here on Scope, I can see that Subscription is my option for scope. I can also assign this to a particular resource group. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Select right here to apply this to my subscription. And the next thing you can do is assign exclusions. Those are specific resources that are exempt. Then you point to your policy definition that you've created right here. You give it a name of your choice, you give it a subscription of your choice, and then you choose whether or not it's either enabled or disabled. After you do that, you can click Review and Create, and that assigns your policy. When you decide to create a cloud application, you normally wouldn't just open the Azure portal and start creating resources. Instead, you'd want to plan your application and make sure the architecture complies with your standards. You need to plan out your virtual network and how it's configured and decide on all the other resource configurations to support your app. There's actually a lot of risk in not planning carefully, and for that reason, most companies will have people with a lot of expertise in doing that kind of work. If you need to deploy your application to another Azure region, you might have to go through that whole process again, and that can end up getting pretty expensive. To help with that problem, Microsoft developed Azure Blueprints. Azure Blueprints allows you to easily reuse configurations, policies, and governance, and that makes deploying to the cloud a lot easier. You configure everything the way it needs to be, apply your policies and governance, things like RBAC, and then you can save that configuration and easily deploy it at any time. Any items that you add to a blueprint are called artifacts. And an artifact can be a resource group, an ARM template, a policy assignment, or a role assignment. Blueprints can be saved to either a subscription or a management group. If you save it in a management group, it can then be used with any subscription that's part of that management group. After you create a blueprint, you publish it, which saves the blueprint. And when you publish it, you provide a version number so you can identify which version it is. And also, you have the option of providing change notes. After you publish it, you can assign it to a subscription. And when you assign the blueprint, it automatically creates all the resources that are defined in the blueprint. Now, you might be wondering what the difference is between a blueprint and an ARM template. Well, you can include an ARM template inside a blueprint as an artifact. And in fact, most blueprints will use ARM templates for deploying Azure resources. However, unlike ARM templates, which are just files that define a deployment, a blueprint is an Azure resource itself, and that means that Azure can maintain a connection between the blueprint and the resources that use it. This makes it easy for you to iterate on your blueprints and improve them, and because you add a version number when you publish a blueprint, you can store them in a source control system to make them easy to track. You've seen that moving to the cloud is not as simple as just opening the Azure portal and clicking some buttons. Moving to the cloud involves a lot of careful planning and education, and you need to learn how to move to the cloud successfully if you're not familiar with it. You have to learn about best practices, how cloud apps should be architected, how to migrate resources, setting up governance and policies, and more. There's a lot to learn. To help you learn what you need to know, Microsoft created the Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure to bring together best practices from Microsoft employees, Microsoft partners, and lessons learned from other Microsoft customers. All this information is available in the Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure website, and you can access that website by browsing to aka.ms/Cloud Adoption Framework. Lesson 12, Describe Privacy and Compliance Resources. In this lesson, you'll learn about the Microsoft core tenets of security, privacy, and compliance. We'll cover the Microsoft Privacy Statement and Microsoft's approach to privacy. You'll find out about the Online Service Terms and Data Protection Amendment, resources that provide transparency into Microsoft services and how they use your data. We'll talk about Trust Center and Microsoft's stance on trust. And we'll cover the Azure compliance documentation that covers just about every data compliance regulation across the globe. We'll also talk about Microsoft's sovereign regions for adherence with specific regulatory requirements in Azure. Let's talk about security, privacy, and compliance. First, security. We all know how important security is. When it comes to the cloud, you need to know that your cloud provider is operating their cloud environment in a secure way. And you also need to know that data you store in the cloud is secure. Microsoft takes security extremely seriously, and they have a global team of security experts who use technology like artificial intelligence and machine learning to keep an eye on what's happening in Azure and keep your resources and your data safe. Microsoft also offers portals like the Trust Center to keep you informed on security, and we'll cover Trust Center later in this module. Microsoft also provides you with the flexibility to configure the security of your resources to meet your needs. Services like Web Application Firewall and VPN Gateway are examples of offerings in Azure that allow you to enhance security. But there are also features of Azure that span across resources, things like role-based access control, Azure Monitor, and Azure Advisor. And of course, you can't forget about Azure Security Center. And all of these just touch the surface. There are a ton of other features and services in Azure that are designed for security. Azure Load Balancer, Azure Application Gateway, network security groups, forced tunneling, data encryption, shared access signatures, penetration testing. The list just goes on and on. But even with all of that, remember that when you're dealing with the cloud, you're dealing with a shared responsibility model. And that means you will need to make sure you're doing your part to keep things secure. But don't worry about that. Microsoft provides plenty of guidance there as well. And with tools like Azure Security Center and Azure Advisor, you have information at your fingertips that can help ensure your resources and data are safe. Another concept that Microsoft focuses intently on is privacy. Now, we've talked about this a little already, but when you're storing sensitive data in the cloud, you want to make sure that data remains private. Microsoft assures that data you store in Azure is private. They don't mine your data in any way. Microsoft gives you full control over where your data is stored, and they provide the tools you need to control who has access to your data. Microsoft assures you of this with the Microsoft Privacy Statement. But Microsoft also complies with privacy standards such as ISO 27018, the EU Model Clauses, EU-US Privacy Shield, FERPA, HIPAA, and many others. Microsoft also realizes that you have requirements you must meet related to standards and requirements, and they offer many ways for you to monitor compliance in Azure. The list of regulatory standards Azure complies with is comprehensive, and in cases where you share in the responsibility of those requirements, Microsoft gives you tools not only to determine what your responsibility is, but also to help you meet them. Tools such as Microsoft Trust Center, Service Trust Center, Azure Policy, Azure Blueprints, and more, those can help you assure compliance. If you want to read more about security, privacy, and compliance in Azure, check out the Security, Privacy, and Compliance in Microsoft Azure white paper by browsing to https://bit.ly/AZ-900-SPC. Customer trust is one of Microsoft's core guiding principles, and keeping you informed about the information they collect and how they use it is also important. And that's why Microsoft publishes a privacy statement that provides you with the personal data that Microsoft collects and how they use it. The privacy statement also outlines reasons why Microsoft might share personal data, such as when you conduct a transaction with Microsoft or if they're required to share data by law. You're also notified about how to access the data that Microsoft has collected and how you can control it, including the ability to opt out of internet-based targeted advertising. Microsoft also includes information about how they use cookies on their websites, and they detail the data that's shared with third parties when you use your Microsoft account for authentication. And finally, the privacy statement details how Microsoft secures data, where they process that data, and the policies that define how long the data gets retained. You can access the Microsoft privacy statement by browsing to aka.ms/privacy statement. Microsoft wants to make Azure's terms of service and their stance on data protection crystal clear. So they operate a web portal where you can read all about product terms. Now, as of this recording, Azure Terms of Service are available in a document called Online Service Terms, or OST. The data protection terms are provided in a document called the Data Protection Amendment, or DPA. You can find both of these by browsing to http://aka.ms/OST. In the future, Microsoft will offer all of this information in the new product term site located at https://www.microsoft.com/licensing/terms. From the product term site, you can search for a Microsoft program and read all the program terms. You can also view terms for all online services and more. The Microsoft privacy statement is all about transparency and how Microsoft deals with your data. But Microsoft also wants to be fully transparent in how they deal with security, privacy, and compliance. All information related to these core tenets is shared in the Trust Center, which is a web portal that details Microsoft's commitment to trust. Here's the Trust Center. If I scroll down, you can see links on how Microsoft deals with security, privacy, and compliance. And you can also see, if I scroll down a little further here, you can see links to blogs that Microsoft maintains and some offerings that help you to maintain compliance. Information on law enforcement data, requests that Microsoft has received, and a report on U.S. national security orders. You scroll down a little more and you can see some events that Microsoft holds for its customers that are related to security and compliance. This kind of transparency can really help you to have confidence in the security of the data that you store in Azure, and it's a really clear indicator of how serious Microsoft is about earning and keeping the trust of its customers. We've already talked a bit about compliance, and there's no doubt that compliance is both extremely important and extremely complex. Chances are your organization has to comply with at least some regulatory standards, and that means you'll need assurance and documentation that Azure complies with those standards as well. Microsoft has comprehensive documentation on compliance to help you out in this area. They provide details on each regulation or standard, and they detail Microsoft's approach to each. And they also provide FAQs and information on using your compliance score to assess your resources. They also provide many additional resources to help keep you informed. Microsoft also provides a comprehensive list of compliance resources that cover everything from audit reports to compliance guides for different countries, so you can be confident in your compliance no matter where you're doing business. All of this compliance documentation is available by browsing to http://bit.ly AZ-900-compliance docs. You've learned how you can use Azure Policy to enforce compliance, but sometimes compliance can't be met by just applying policies. For example, some areas in the U.S. government require that all data stays in the United States and that only citizens of the U.S. have access to any system that stores that data. You can't meet that kind of requirement with policies, so Microsoft has created a completely isolated cloud called Azure Government. Azure Government enforces the requirements of the U.S. government, and it's only accessible by Microsoft employees who are U.S. citizens and who are screened. Azure Government uses completely isolated data centers and express route locations, and they use their own dedicated fiber. Azure Government isn't only for the federal government. City and municipal governments can use it as well, but Microsoft will vet everyone who attempts to sign up for Azure Government to ensure they're a representative of the government. Azure Government has all the same features as the public cloud, but there are some small differences. For example, you access Azure Government using the URL portal.azure.us instead of portal.azure.com. The United States Department of Defense has additional compliance requirements that are called DoD Impact Level 5 Provisional Authorization, and it's meant to allow for the storage of controlled, unclassified information. There is a subset of data centers in Azure Government that are compliant with DoD Impact Level 5 Provisional Authorization. There are also important regulations in the EU that must be met for any country operating within the EU, and to address that, Microsoft created a distinct cloud in the EU called Azure Germany. Azure Germany is available for customers in the EU, the European Free Trade Association, and in the UK. Azure Germany data centers are all located in Germany, and they're operated under strict security measures by a local company named T-Systems International. This is a subsidiary of Deutsche Telekom. T-Systems International operates as the data trustee, and they have full control over all of the data in Azure Germany. Microsoft is only involved in managing the systems. They have no access to the data that's in Azure Germany. Now, there's a third sovereign cloud located in China called, Azure China. Azure China is operated by Shanghai Blue Cloud Technology Company Limited, but it's often referred to as simply Blue Cloud. And Blue Cloud is owned by Beijing 21 Vianet Broadband Data Center Company Limited, and they're usually referred to as 21 Vianet. Azure China isn't currently full-featured, but Microsoft is working hard to add new features all the time. For the most updated list, check out bit.ly/AZ-900-Azure China. Welcome to Module 6, Describe Azure Pricing, SLAs, and Service Lifecycles. In Lesson 13, we'll talk about the factors that can affect your costs, and you'll learn how you can forecast and manage your costs. You'll even learn how you can forecast costs before you create your first Azure service. In Lesson 14, we'll talk all about Azure SLAs, and you'll learn about preview services and features and how the Azure Lifecycle works. Lesson 13, Describe methods for planning and management of costs. This lesson is where you'll learn about some of the factors that can affect your costs in Azure and how you can plan accordingly to ensure you save money wherever possible. We'll talk about the pricing calculator and the total cost of ownership calculator, two tools that can help you with forecasting your costs before you move to Azure. We'll wrap up with a discussion of Azure Cost Management, a tool for helping you keep a close eye on your costs in Azure. As you're planning your Azure deployments, you should always keep the factors that can affect your costs in mind. There are meters assigned to every resource, and this is how Microsoft charges you for those resources. For example, you aren't explicitly charged for an Azure Virtual Network. Instead, you're charged for traffic that flows into and out of the network, and meters are used to track that data. To keep costs as low as possible, you should plan how you purchase your resources. For example, if you agree to pay in advance using an enterprise agreement, you can save a lot of money. Cloud solution partners might also provide you with complete solutions that are more cost-effective than purchasing all of the services yourself. You should also keep in mind that resources in some regions cost more than those same resources in a different region. For example, a VM deployed to the central US region will cost more than the same VM deployed to the East US region. Even so, deploying to the cheapest region isn't always the best choice because if you have to pay for network traffic between regions, that could actually increase your costs. You can also significantly reduce your costs by taking advantage of reserved instances and reserved capacity. Reserved instances are Azure VMs that you commit to using for either 1 year or 3 years. Reserved capacity refers to a commitment to workloads on Azure SQL Database, Azure Cosmos DB, Azure Synapse Analytics, or Azure Cache for Redis. Reserved instances can save you up to 72% on VMs, and reserved capacity can save anywhere from 33 to 80% based on your usage. Another great way to save money is by using Azure's Hybrid Use Benefit. Hybrid Use Benefit allows you to use your existing Windows Server or SQL Server licenses for cloud-based resources. Using Hybrid Benefit pricing, you can save up to 40% on VMs and up to 55% on Azure SQL Database. And combine that with reserved instances, and you can save even more. If you want to use a VM for a workload that isn't time sensitive and that can stand to be interrupted, you can save by using spot pricing. Spot VMs are allocated in Azure's unused VM capacity pool, but if a spot VM is needed to satisfy capacity requirements from Azure customers, Microsoft will either deallocate the VM or delete the VM based on how you configure it. If a VM is configured to be deallocated when Azure needs it, you might be able to redeploy that VM later, but it's not guaranteed. Therefore, you need to carefully check your requirements to ensure that this is a good option for you. One other factor that affects costs is the zone that you deploy to. Microsoft separates Azure regions into 4 separate groups for billing purposes, and these groups are called billing zones or simply zones. Microsoft's network costs in these zones differs, so your cost will differ too. The cheapest outbound network costs are in Zone 1. DE Zone 1 is the second cheapest, followed by Zone 2 and then Zone 3. All the zones are listed here, along with all the regions that are in each zone. So as we've seen, there are many factors that can impact your Azure costs, and it can be pretty hard to try and predict your costs in advance. And that's why Microsoft created the pricing calculator. The pricing calculator can provide you with an estimate of your Azure expenses, and it bases that estimate on the type of product you choose, but it also factors in where that product is deployed, because as you've seen, costs differ depending on region and zone. And it also accounts for other factors that can impact your costs. You can access the pricing calculator by browsing to aka.ms/Azure pricing. So let's head over there and let's have a look at the pricing calculator. So this is the pricing calculator in my browser. And by default on this screen, we have a list of products that I can add to an estimate. But I can also click on the Example Scenarios tab, and I can get a list of different scenarios that might reflect what I want to do in Azure and get an estimate on those, which includes numerous different products. In this example, I'm going to just choose products, and for this demo, I'm just going to use virtual machines to kind of show you how the calculator works. So to add virtual machines to my estimate, I just click on it, and you'll notice that will tell me virtual machines have been added. Now to see my estimate, I need to scroll down to right here. Now this is the estimate that I have for virtual machines, and this is the default setting for that estimate. So I can see here that my estimate total is $152.62. But let's say that I don't want to deploy this to West US. I'm actually going to deploy this to the East US. So I'll select East US as my region, and notice that automatically my price has dropped now to $137.29. I can also choose a different operating system, so I'll choose Linux, and notice here my price has dropped again, and that's because now I don't have to pay for Windows licensing. And so every time that you make changes in the calculator, it's going to update your estimate based on that. So I can go down and I can choose what type of instance I want. And notice there are a very large number of instance types. If I have the need only for one CPU and 28 gigabytes of RAM and 56 gigabytes of temporary storage, I can select that, and that's going to also update my estimate total. So now I have a larger estimate because I am actually using a more powerful machine. I can also choose my billing option. So if I see pay as you go is going to give me 270.83, but if I choose one of these agreements and I commit to a longer term pricing, I can get quite substantial savings. Also, I have the ability to choose manage disks. I can actually change my tier here. I can change my disk size. I can change the number of disks, etc. And I can change my storage transactions as well. I can choose whether or not I want to include a support plan and whether I want to choose any other programs and offers. And then what I can do is choose purchase options to see how I can purchase that particular estimate. Now I can also save this estimate, and I can export this estimate to Excel, or I can share it with someone. If I save it, if I scroll back up here to the top, you'll see I have the ability to click Saved Estimate. So if I save my estimate, I can go back to it at a later time. That allows me to maybe tweak it a little more later, or if I want to save that and export it later on, I can do that as well. The pricing calculator is a good way to estimate your Azure expenses. But if you want to estimate how much money Azure could save you versus your on-premises deployments, the total cost of ownership calculator, or the TCO calculator, is the right tool for the job. The TCO calculator provides an estimate of cost savings that you could realize by moving on-premises applications to the cloud. And data in the TCO calculator is based on expense information for on-premises resources that Microsoft has accumulated over many years of experience. TCO calculator includes detailed charts on expense savings over a long period of time by moving to Azure. And you can access the TCO calculator by browsing to aka.ms/Azure TCO. So let's go have a look at the TCO calculator. So here is the TCO calculator in the browser, and the very first thing you have to do is you have to define your workloads. Now this means you have to tell the TCO calculator what your on-premises application needs. So if I click on Add Server Workload here, I can adjust this based on what my particular application uses. So let's say that it uses a Windows physical server using Windows. I'm going to say one server. Let's say that I have 2 procs in my servers, and each of those are 2 core procs. And I have, let's say, maybe 16 gigabytes of RAM in each one of those, and all of that looks good. Now if I click here to add Windows Server 2008 R2, that's also going to adjust my particular details on my workload. Okay, so now I've got this workload. I've called this workload 1, so that's fine. I'm going to go down here now and add a database. And I'm going to accept all the defaults for this. I'm going to say it's a Microsoft SQL Server database, and that's fine. Storage, I can add networking. So those are all of the different workloads that I can add. Now, let's say that I have multiple servers. So let's say that this particular server is actually my application server. Let's say that I might also have another server that's like a business logic server or something like that. I can click Add Server Workload here and add an additional server. Okay, so this is our application database. Now I'm going to add some storage here, and this is where I add my disk drives. So I'm going to say a 1 terabyte disk drive. That's totally fine. This is our hard disk storage. And my network bandwidth, 1 gigabyte. That's totally fine. So I'm going to go ahead and click Next. And now I can adjust my assumptions. Now these are the assumptions that, as I said earlier, are based off of years of data that Microsoft has accumulated. And so what it's going to do is assume some things based off of what I have given it. And I can scroll down here and I can see all of the different assumptions that Microsoft has made, and that includes electricity costs, that includes storage costs, IT labor costs, and any other assumptions. As long as I'm satisfied with what's here, I can go ahead and click Next, or I can adjust them. I'm just going to go ahead and click Next. That's fine. And now I can view a report that will show me how much I can save. So I can see here over 5 years with Microsoft Azure, my estimated cost savings could be as much as $186,423. So that seems like something that I might definitely want to consider moving to the cloud. Also down here, notice I have this graph which shows me my costs over that 5-year period on premises versus in the cloud. I also have some other pie charts down here that actually show me some of my expense data broken out into different categories, and then I can also see additional breakdown as well. So this is a very detailed analysis of how much I would pay for this application on premises versus how much I would pay on Azure. So when I get down to the bottom here, I have the ability to download this report, share this report, or save it with someone. But let's say that I look at that and I say, I'm sold. I definitely want to get this up and running. And in fact, I'm saving so much money, I want to do this immediately. I can create a free Azure account right here and start experimenting with that, or I can click this button and have Microsoft contact me for some discussions about how I might want to purchase an enterprise agreement or other ways that I can save additional costs as I look at implementing this solution within Azure. Azure Cost Management is another tool that allows you to keep an eye on your costs and manage your expenses in Azure. Azure Cost Management makes it possible to analyze your costs at a granular level, and you can create budgets so that you can control your costs, and you can even create alerts that will notify specific people when certain thresholds are exceeded in your costs. Azure Cost Management is available in the Azure portal by searching for Cost Management plus Billing. So as you can see here, Azure Cost Management provides a breakdown of your expenses by resource type, region, and resource group. And I can also see a graph of my costs over time. I can budget my expenses in Azure Cost Management, and if I exceed my budget, I can clearly see that in my cost analysis graph. So this is a great way to keep an eye on my expenses in Azure over time and to make sure that I'm making the best use of my cloud resources. Lesson 14. Describe Azure Service Level Agreements, SLAs, and Service Lifecycles. In this lesson, you'll learn about what an SLA is in Azure. We'll also cover the life cycle of Azure services and how a service makes it to production quality. Service level agreements, or SLAs, establish specific targets for availability, and they also define what a cloud provider will do when those targets aren't met. SLAs are represented as a percentage of availability over a specific time period, and they're usually above 99%. I mean, if a cloud provider promised that your service would be available 80% of the time, you'd likely go somewhere else for your cloud application needs. No one is going to offer a 100% SLA. It's just simply not possible. The highest SLA is 99.999%, which is commonly referred to as 5 nines. This is obviously what all cloud providers aim for, but a more typical SLA is 99.9% or 99.95%. A service is only outside of an SLA if a problem is caused by something that's within the control of the cloud provider. If a problem is caused by your application or maybe another component that the cloud provider doesn't control, there is no SLA on that. If a service's availability does fall outside of the SLA, the cloud provider will often provide some level of refund, but in Azure, you must submit a claim to Microsoft within 2 months of the end of the billing cycle. As Azure product teams create new features and services, they'll often offer pre-release versions to customers. Microsoft calls these pre-releases previews, and there are 2 different types of previews: private previews and public previews. And then once a service or a feature leaves preview, it's considered generally available, or GA. Private previews are normally offered only to a very small number of customers, and they're often offered by invitation. Public previews, on the other hand, are available to most Azure customers. Preview features are not designed for production use. They can change often, and some of those changes might actually break your resources. Also, for that reason, previews offer no SLA, but they're often offered at a reduced price. Preview features in the Azure portal will usually display preview badging. For example, in this image, you can see Azure App Service Editor, and it's clearly labeled as a preview feature. You'll likely see this kind of badging in many other Azure services as well. Well, that's it. You've completed your journey through Azure Fundamentals. You now have some great knowledge about Azure under your belt so that you can be better prepared to take the AZ-900 exam. You're also prepared to be a valuable resource in your company for evaluating and recommending your company's approach to the cloud. In this course, you learned all about cloud concepts. You learned what benefits the cloud provides, and you learned about the different service types available, such as IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. You also gained a deeper understanding of the differences between the public cloud, the private cloud, and hybrid cloud scenarios. You learned all about some of the core services in Azure, and you learned about some of the under-the-hood concepts, such as Azure Regions, Availability Zones, and Azure Resource Manager. You learned all about core services in Azure. You learned about compute products, networking, storage, and database solutions. And you learned about the Azure Marketplace for jump-starting your cloud experience. You also learned about cool technologies like the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, and you learned about machine learning and serverless computing in Azure. You also learned how to use the Azure Portal, PowerShell, and the Azure CLI to manage all these services. And you learned about Cloud Shell and using the Azure app on your mobile device. You found out how you can use Azure Monitor to keep track of all your Azure services. And you learned how to configure alerts so the right people are notified of problems when necessary. You learned how you can monitor the health of Azure itself with Azure Service Health, so you'll know if you're being impacted by a problem in Azure. You learned about security, privacy, and trust. And you learned about compliance with regulations. You learned about Azure security products such as Azure Firewall and Azure DDoS protection. You learned about how to use network security groups and how to best choose the right security option for your needs. You learned about identity solutions such as Azure Active Directory and multi-factor authentication. You also learned how you can control how users access your resources using conditional access and role-based access control. You now know how you can manage the creation and management of Azure resources using Azure Policy. And you learned about preventing unwanted changes using locks and even how you can keep someone from unintentionally deleting an Azure resource. You also learned about using tags to organize your resources and how you can use Azure Blueprints to create reusable environments configured for your specific needs. You discovered Microsoft's approach to privacy and trust, and you learned about tools like Trust Center, Online Service Terms, the Data Protection Amendment, and Azure Compliance Documentation. You also learned about Microsoft's sovereign regions and Microsoft's approach to the unique security and compliance needs of governments in other countries. Finally, you learned all about Azure pricing, SLAs, and service lifecycles. You learned all about the tools you can use to plan and manage costs, tools like Pricing Calculator and the Total Cost of Ownership Calculator. You learned about Azure Cost Management so that you can easily track your costs and make wise financial decisions about your cloud usage. You learned about the Azure SLA, and we wrapped up with a discussion of the service lifecycle and how you can keep up with feature and service updates, as well as how you can access new features early in the development process. With all this knowledge, you're now much better prepared to take the AZ-900 Microsoft Azure Fundamentals exam. I hope what you learn in this course gives you confidence in your knowledge of Azure, and I hope you enjoyed taking this course as much as I enjoyed teaching you. Thank you, and good luck on your exam.